There are new warnings on the overheated East Coast property market. Deloitte Access Economics says the economy is sitting on a housing powder keg, and rate rises from the RBA could provide the spark that sets it off. And despite a 5-year bull run, prices are still on the rise. Capital city values rose 1.8% in June. That's according to the latest numbers from CoreLogic. Hobart narrowly led the charge from Melbourne, both up nearly 3%. Sydney posting a rise of just over 2%. Darwin, Adelaide and Brisbane all went backwards. Auction clearance rates dipped in the two biggest cities and were still in the high 60% range in Sydney and over 70% for Melbourne. So is the economy sitting on a property debt bomb? For their view, I caught up with property analyst Louis Christopher from SQM Research and the REA Group's Nerida Conisbee. Nerida Conisbee, Louis Christopher, thank you for joining us for this discussion. Nerida, I might start with you on this. We've had Deloitte come out and suggest that the Australian property market is a powder keg. That implies that all we need is one spark, right, to set this thing alight.
Look, I don't think so. I mean, we'd certainly have to see a pretty bad situation occurring. I was in the UK recently. You've got Brexit. I mean, even that has taken a while to flow through to the housing market. In Australia, I mean, we'd have to have pretty rapid rises in interest rates for there to be a dramatic decline in house prices.
Louis Christopher, do you agree with that? Haven't we seen in overseas examples that if sentiment changes, even if it's not related necessarily to a rise in unemployment or a rise in interest rates, that if the speculative aspect of that market changes its mind about what's going to happen, that we could see selling off happen quite rapidly?
Oh, it's true that, look, all it takes is one trigger and sentiment can change, and then you have a correction in the marketplace. Though I think we need to take into account a number of factors which are driving the market right now. One of the main ones is actually population growth, and that's been driving underlying demand. You may recall this time last year, the Reserve Bank of Australia was quite concerned about oversupply in the Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane markets. Well, what's actually played out is we've only had oversupply in the Brisbane market.
Nerida Conisbee, let's take the issue of the rent. There seems to be a disconnect now between what we're seeing on rents and what we're seeing on property prices, which would suggest a lot of this buying action is actually speculative, doesn't it?
Look, rents have remained pretty stable. I mean, but they do remain very expensive. I mean, if you have a look in Sydney at the moment, you need to be a household earning well over $100,000 per annum to be able to afford an average home. So affordability isn't just cutting across buyers, it's also cutting across renters. Things have improved, as you've said. There has been a lot of demand from investors. They have really put a cap on rental growth.
The trigger, Louis Christopher, could come from offshore. The RBA obviously sets interest rate settings here, but it's heavily influenced by what happens overseas. It looks like we're in a rate tightening stage across the globe at the moment. If that occurs, it could put downward pressure on the Australian dollar, which could see inflation increase, which may mean the Reserve Bank has to raise interest rates here. How tight could that get for those people who are highly leveraged?
Our view is from here, it would be circa 150 basis points, so 1.5% may well create that type of trigger. But in order to see that come through, we would need to see surely a rise in inflation or a massive contraction in credit, similar to, say, another GFC. Now, when we look back to the global financial crisis, let's consider how the banking sector responded. Okay, firstly, they kept the credit taps for housing running. They actually turned off the credit taps on commercial and they cut interest rates. And this is the thing right now. If we were to have some type of crisis which involved a contraction in credit, the Reserve Bank of Australia would respond by aggressively cutting interest rates once again, or potentially doing something even further.
Nerida Conisbee, we know the Reserve Bank is very concerned about what's happening in the property market. Since Philip Lowe came to the governorship, he's pointed out repeatedly how high Australian household debt levels are, highest in the world at current best estimates. We're also seeing low wages growth. There's pressure on the banks already to curb investment lending, particularly interest-only loans. Do you think that's going to get tighter? And have you already seen a flow-on effect into the property market through your work?
Yeah, look, the interest rates are already rising for home buyers. If you have a look at what banks are doing, they are increasing them. And the banks are under a lot of pressure. If you have a look at their costs of wholesale funding, a lot of it's coming out of the US. The US rates are going up. We have a new banking tax, APRA onto them about the risk and the high levels of debt. How high will they get? You know, we don't really know, but I think banks will be very, very careful. I mean, it's not in their interest for people to start defaulting on loans. And so I think overall it doesn't really matter what the Reserve Bank does. I think at the moment, if you're a homeowner, you're going to see increasing rates.
What's your best and worst case scenarios of how this plays out in the property market over the next year?
Well, best case is that the market stabilises. I mean, that's, I think, everyone wants it. If we're starting to see price growth of, you know, in excess of 20% in any market, it isn't a good situation for anyone. But worst case, you know, a large drop in prices. I mean, but typically we don't see a big drop in prices unless there's a major crisis. I mean, the last time we saw a big drop in Sydney was following the GFC, where we saw a big rise in unemployment. So, you know, that would be worst case, but at the moment, you know, we're not really seeing a rising unemployment scenario, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne.
Lou, Christopher, same question to you.
Well, there's always a risk that a worst case scenario where you see double-digit major correction in our big capital cities play out. For that to play out, though, I think that would be a combination of a dramatic rise in interest rates and a sharp rise in unemployment. I don't see that scenario playing out in the next 12 months. There is a possibility we may well get a rate rise. There's also a possibility at this time we may get a rate cut. Our consensus view right now is that the market in Sydney is likely to continue to slow down in the second half of the year, but we're waiting and seeing in terms of the response of first home buyers in the marketplace. Just remember, the New South Wales government has now brought in some pretty sizable concessions for first home buyers to get into the marketplace. And by the recent auction clearance rate activity, that is suggesting to us that, yes, indeed, first home buyers are entering into the market and somewhat offsetting the investors that are leaving the market right now. So it's hard to see at this point in time a hard landing in 2017 for Sydney or indeed Melbourne. 2018, though, could be a rather interesting year. If we were to see rapid rate rises in that year, yeah, that would create a correction in the market.
Lou, Christopher, Nerida Conisbee, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.